Rachel Slade has spent a decade in the city magazine trenches of Boston Magazine, first as the design editor and then ultimately as the executive editor. In 2015, Rachel helped steer Boston to a top national award for the City and Regional Magazine Association. In 2016, Yankee Magazine ran Rachel's long-form narrative about the sinking of the container ship El Faro. The book was a finalist and winner of many national awards, and that followed, and the book was Into the Raging Sea. Rachel's second book, Making It in America, The Almost Impossible Quest to Manufacture in the USA, was released in January earlier this year. And as you'll hear more about tonight, it tells the story of American Roots, a company right in Westbrook, Maine, just a few miles from here. In addition, Rachel's editing and writing have won national awards in civic journalism, reporting, criticism, and reader service. And she's also spent some time as a lecturer in the political science and journalism department in the Jonathan M. Tisch College of Civic Studies at Tufts University. Rachel holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in political science from Barnard College and a Master of Architecture from the University of Pennsylvania. She splits her time between Brookline, Massachusetts, and Rockport, Maine. Please join me in welcoming Rachel Slade for her lecture, Making It in America.
Yay, back in Maine. I've already met so many of you, and I've really enjoyed getting to know you. So I'm excited to be here. I'm probably not going to be telling you anything new. This is just going to be a review of everything you already know because it's such an erudite crowd. So yes, I'm fascinated with Maine. I write about Maine, but I am originally from here. Now, you cannot say where this is, but can anybody identify this? This is a photo from 1920. What? Closer when you said Cleveland. It's a dirty city, right? It's covered in coal. What you see in front of you, actually in the foreground, is the Baldwin Locomotive Factory. This is my hometown of Philadelphia. Woo! Yeah, who's from Philadelphia? That's right. I show this picture because I was brought up in this big, dirty, and very post-industrial city. Growing up in Philadelphia really shaped how I thought about the world, but also how I thought about America and American culture. All around me were the vestiges of this very, very powerful country that once was. And I went to school in New York City. I went to Barnard in New York City. And so I'd take the train between Philadelphia and New York. And that entailed going north, through North Philadelphia, which is where most of the manufacturing had been. So in Philadelphia, we used to make everything, including Stetson hats. Those 10-gallon hats were actually made in Philadelphia, Baldwin locomotives. There was a huge textile industry there, just like up here. I'm not telling you anything you don't know because there used to be so much industry here as well. But going from Philadelphia to New York and seeing just the wasteland that was left behind when industry left just made a deep, deep impression on me. It was haunting to try to even fathom how we could have done this to ourselves, how we could abandon each other in that way. The city had depended All the people in the city had depended on industry, not only as a living, but as a pathway to the middle class, right? And so much of that, so many of us, and we're going to tell this story, right? So many of us have immigrant stories that involve manufacturing, because manufacturing is oftentimes the first step when you arrive in a country on your way up that ladder. When you do arrive in a place that has social mobility, which is what America promises. So we're going to be talking about that. We're going to be talking a lot about history, what happened in the manufacturing world in America and around the world. And then we're going to home in a little town, Westbrook, Maine, which is the focus of my book, Making It in America. All right, so we're going to back up a little bit. 18th century British colonial America. Now, the reason I'm going here is because I want to talk about the foundation of America. This is who we were. We were the providers of raw goods, which went pretty much straight to England. And then England would process those goods and send them back to us as manufactured goods. We send over the lumber, the furs, the dried fish, the whale oil, the iron, the gunpowder, the rice, the tobacco, and the indigo. And then we would buy back the finished products. Does that sound familiar? Yes, because now we're doing exactly the same thing, just on the other ocean, on the other side. So this was the condition that Americans faced, or sorry, colonialists faced, and it's part of the reason that they fought a war, to divorce themselves from the need to buy everything from another country, to import everything. It was expensive, but it was also debilitating because we could not speak for ourselves. And just to remind you, we did make things here. These are Winthrop Gray shoes made in Boston in the 1790s, so that's after the Revolution. And on the other slide, I guess that would be your right, is a dress of hand-loomed linen with silk that was made in Boston in 1759. So there was manufacturing here, but of course it was pre-industrial, right? It was done by hand. Everything was done by hand. Now, meanwhile, in the 18th century, England was way advanced in terms of industrialization. They already had power looms. They were hooking up all kinds of things to other things and really starting to herald the Industrial Revolution, mostly because they wanted to make cheap cotton textiles, right? They had been importing those textiles from India, and then they put India out of business by figuring out how to make those same cottons with machines in England and then selling them to us for a great profit. Okay, I'm skipping over a lot of history, but United States becomes a nation, so how do we finance our government? Apropos of the recent election, I wanted to mention just a couple of things. So after the war, the US was in huge debt, right, to the Dutch, to the French, but also to domestic creditors, to the tune of, at that time, $80 million, which doesn't sound like a lot, it's very quaint, $80 million, haha. That's in 18th century dollars. So Alexander Hamilton, who's really the architect of a lot of our economic policy, wasn't so concerned about the amount of debt. What he saw from the very beginning was that in order for a country to function well, it didn't matter how much your debt was. What mattered was, could you borrow cheaply? Could you borrow cheaply when you need it? And what was the thing that allowed countries to borrow cheaply? It was a really solid source of revenue. So he knew that in order to get America up and running, because the government was broke, it had no money, it had no source of revenue, the best thing to do was to figure out very quickly how to tax people, how to get a regular tax base going. That way, then, creditors would say, well, the United States, yeah, they're pretty young, they're pretty much infants, but hey, look, they have a regular source of revenue, so we're going to loan them money at very good rates. And we have been following that rule for the next 200 years, okay? So, in Alexander Hamilton's mind, not so much worried about the national debt, much more concerned about your credit rating. And by the way, that's how billionaires think too, right? They borrow money. They borrow money. Billionaires never cash out anything. They never spend their own money. They always borrow, because borrowing is cheaper. Now, the thing that George Washington asked Alexander Hamilton to do, besides figure out how to make money for the government so that we can start to do things, was he said, hey, look, we don't want to buy British goods anymore, because if we continue to buy British goods, we're basically going to be a British colony once again in just a couple of years. And by the way, that's what the British thought was going to happen to America, right? That's why they came back in 1812. They said, America, you had fun, you won your little war, we're coming back, we're going to take you over because you are not financially independent. So what did Americans have to do? Make stuff. We had to figure out how to make stuff for ourselves. That was the foundation on which this country was built. So, George Washington said, hey, Al, how do we start a manufacturing revolution? And this is what Alexander Hamilton came up with. 3 points. He said, tariff imported goods so that stuff's expensive, the imported stuff's expensive, that'll balance out the cost of getting this thing going. Number 2, use that tariff revenue to actually start, so I'm doing it out of order, but use that tariff revenue to stimulate the economy by building infrastructure. So we can get the cotton from the south up to the north where we make the things, right? So that we can get these things around the country and start really supporting each other, making, selling, domestic supply chain. And then thirdly, his point was, let's get a national bank together so we can stabilize our currency and finance research and development. Now, again, that's about loans, right? Like borrowing is such a critical part of industry. And I just also wanted to point out that thanks to the fact that we actually did establish a fairly credible tax base and never defaulted on our loans, we could always borrow money when we needed to. For example, when we had to fight a World War I, a World War II, whenever we got into these very, very large issues, there was money for us to stimulate the economy, to build those ships, to build those planes, to get troops where they needed to go so that we could fight fascism. All right, so how did Americans actually get their industrial revolution started? Corporate espionage. In case you don't know the fun little story, I always get this wrong. Henry Cabot Lowell, I might be getting it wrong, basically passed himself off as a country bumpkin, and he left Boston in, I think, 1808, and went over to England and talked his way into the powered looms there, the mills, the big mills that were making all this incredible textile stuff that was England's, big industry. And he used his photographic memory to memorize how the machinery worked. And he got back to these new United States, got back to Boston, looked at the Charles River and Waltham and said, this would be a good place for me to set up a power mill. This building that I'm showing you was built in 1813 by the Boston Manufacturing Company. It was the first fully integrated factory in the United States. That means that they took the raw cotton and they spun it and wove it right there into cotton textiles. That's just outside of Boston. The building is still there. The other building is Samuel Slater's factory of 1793. That was a water-powered, just a spinning mill. It wasn't fully integrated. That's why, now as a Bostonian, I'd like to talk much more about the Boston Manufacturing Company. And very quickly, we start to produce all kinds of things. Now, you'll notice that I'm focusing on textiles and apparel because ultimately that's what we're going to be talking about here. We have this child's dress that was an American-made President cotton, probably from one of Lowell's mills in 1830, and shoes on the left. Speaking of shoes, Maine, shoes, big shoe capital, but actually most of the shoes, women's shoes anyway, were made within 50 miles of Haverhill, Massachusetts. And I just love this Haverhill shoe factory map from 1896. All those little buildings all around the periphery of the map are shoe factories. So in the US, in 1950, the US boasted 12,000 shoe factories, and now there are only 924. I also want to mention shoes because one of the main benefactors of the University of New England, which is where we are, is the Alphon family. Do you know where they got their money? They're one of the wealthiest families in the United States. And they got their money because they were Dexter shoe. So they were manufacturing shoes in Dexter for a couple generations. And in the late 80s, I believe it's Harold Alphon, made a deal with Warren Buffett and sold Dexter shoe. Shortly thereafter, NAFTA was passed, and suddenly nobody was making shoes in the United States anymore. We're going to talk about that. Warren Buffett in 2008 said to a group, a esteemed group just like you, he said it was the worst investment he's ever made. However, the benefit went to Maine. And so we are the beneficiaries of this incredible manufacturing history. Thousands of people made shoes for Dexter. Hundreds of thousands of people made a living making shoes and clothing here in New England. You know that because the relics are all around you. The other thing about manufacturing that I want to mention is that it also supports countless industries beyond it, right? So you need the machinery to be able to do the manufacturing. That's a given. So here is a beautiful photograph of a piece of machinery made in Massachusetts. You also need all the attendant pieces and parts. So for the apparel industry, for example, you need thread. These are all this is a beautiful photograph of many different thread companies that used to exist around the United States that provided beautiful threads for the production of clothing and, beautifully sewn goods. The other thing about textile and apparel manufacturing here in New England is that it didn't just finance us, the UNE, it also financed, for example, the Museum of Fine Arts. Lowell, of course, became incredibly wealthy. They were major benefactors of Harvard University, and I think there was at least one or two Lowell presidents, but they also basically built Boston. So the wealth of Boston was built on the textile mills all around Massachusetts and Maine. So when Lowell built that first factory, when the Boston Manufacturing Company was in its infancy, who did they hire? Well, as you can see on the left, they were hiring originally farm girls. There was no industrial base here, right? There weren't many immigrants coming into the United States. So originally, these mills were kind of like campuses for young women. So they would work on the farms, so they knew about hard work, and they knew about waking up early and working long hours. But the enticement to their families and to them was that they could come, young women, 15, 16 years old, could come work in the mill for a couple of years, live in dormitory-like situations, get lectures just like you're getting tonight, including from luminaries like Charles Dickens, who actually came through the Lowell factory to give a lecture, but also to see. So they would get lectures, and they would also get a little cash in their pockets. They were not paid with scrip, company script, they were paid with cash. And then they could return to the farm and get married. That was a really great model, and it was kind of the antidote, the American response, the early American response to what Lowell had seen in England, which was dire poverty, a real exploitation of the worker under this new factory plan, right? So his idea was, we can do better, we're Americans, we're doing this for each other. At the same time, you also have these young girls finding their voice. So this is really interesting. You see, this is the constitution of the Lowell Factory Girls Association. So I have a photograph here of some young women who are working at the factory, and they actually started to think much more about, well, we're working, we deserve a certain wage, we deserve certain living conditions and working conditions. And so this was also the awakening of the American labor movement, if you will. These are young women starting to think about how they're contributing to the economy, to this new young republic, and thinking about where they fit into this. And that's going to be a constant in this discussion. Well, things start to change very quickly because immigrants start arriving on our shores. So remember, manufacturing has always been a pathway to the American middle class. Immigrants drive industry. They provide labor, and by doing that, they increase the GDP. And of course, they're not just working, they're also buying, selling, creating their own enterprises. So they increase the tax base. In the 19th century, of course, we had enslaved former African citizens here in the United States. We also had Scottish and Irish and Quebecois and Chinese laborers. The Chinese, of course, built the railroad. Then came the Dutch, the Germans, the Italians, fueling innovation and productivity. And then, when the Russian Empire began to collapse, you get the Eastern Europeans arriving, further fueling innovation and productivity. And that is my history. You have found yourselves somewhere in the story that I just told in 2 sentences. My great-grandfather came over from Eastern Europe in the 1880s. He actually ended up running a factory in southern New Jersey. By running that factory and eventually owning it, he ended up sending 5 of his children to University of Pennsylvania in the 1920s. That is the dream of manufacturing. That is in my DNA, and that's why I care so much about manufacturing in the United States, how it shapes our culture, how it shapes our thinking about immigrants, and how it shapes our thinking about each other and how we treat each other and how we treat the things that we wear and use. Okay, the 20th century. Up to 1980. So the 20th century in the United States was very much about thinking of the human cost of industry. The 19th century was so much about expansion, right? Expanding all the way to California, manifest destiny with its own horrors. But also what fueled that was industry here in New England. So the 20th century then was a time of wealth. And that gave Americans the opportunity to think more introspectively, more thoughtfully about how they were treating each other. So the human cost of industry sparks an interest in codifying workers' rights and safety. Before that, we had no rights. So like workers, whatever the factor worker decided was acceptable was acceptable. If you couldn't breathe, you couldn't breathe. If you were dealing with mercury and getting sick, if you were dealing with toxic chemicals, you're bad. Sorry, that's the cost of business. There was also the environmental cost of industry, polluted waterways, which we in Maine know very much about, and the air and the soil. And so all of that, of course, leads to Nixon's signing of the Environmental Protection Act. Okay, so I want to say that, workers' rights laws and environmental laws take a huge amount of effort and bloodshed to enact. These are difficult laws to pass, and they're expensive because they're putting pressure on industry to abide by laws. Abide by laws that industry would rather not abide by, right? Like protecting workers is expensive. Making sure that workers, that there are guardrails around these massive drive belts, for example, that's expensive. Airbags are expensive. All this stuff is expensive. But the rights that emerged throughout the 20th century in the United States were really passed by legislators who believed that part of the promise of being an American was that you had the right to work with dignity, right? That if you were an American and if you were going to contribute to our economy, then you had the right to do it safely and with dignity. These laws reflect the values of our nation. Part of the reason that they were passed was because of photography. So this is a photograph by Lewis Hine. It was taken probably in 1901, 1902. So Lewis Hine is very famous. You probably know his beautiful black and white photographs of kids who worked in, for example, coal mines and steel mills. This is a young woman in Winchendon, Maine. And so when people, especially women and wealthy women, especially in New York City, started seeing these photographs of children and the conditions under which they were working, when they started to see these photographs, they wondered whether this was the right thing to do. At the same time, women were starting to ask for the right to vote. So women, again, I'm focusing on New York because New York was kind of the nexus of where this concern about workers' rights, suffrage, and children's children's labor was really happening, mostly because you had a lot of wealthy women who were now talking to each other. They're looking at these photographs, they're buying things, they're running households, and they're wondering, under what conditions were these things made? Am I culpable in the conditions under which these children are working? You also have this big strike, the Bread and Roses strike in 1912, which was, again, about wages. But it's kind of this conflation of all these things coming together, the photography, women's suffrage, and the idea that we should be protecting our fellow Americans. And then, in 1911, was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. Are you familiar with this? This is very much a part of my history, but is this something familiar to you? Yes? Okay. So 146 women and girls perished in this fire. What's interesting, what many people don't know, so this fire happened on the afternoon of a Friday on the 8th story of a building that was just off of Washington Square Park in New York City. What a lot of people don't know is the reason that the girls couldn't get out of the factory was that the factory doors were locked. Why were they locked? To prevent union organizers from getting in and encouraging the girls to join the labor movement so that they could protect their wages and fight for better working conditions. So this happened on a Friday afternoon. It became so hot that girls jumped out of windows. Something very similar happened almost exactly 100 years later in Bangladesh, which, by the way, is a major producer of clothes that we wear here in the United States. In the Rana Plaza collapse, 2013, 1,134 workers died, just to give you a sense of the scale. One person who actually was a witness to the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire was Frances Perkins, and I bring her up for you because both of her parents were from Maine. She's a fascinating woman. She was based in New York, and after she was born and raised in Boston, but she moved to New York. And this made a huge impression on her, the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. She actually ended up becoming the first female cabinet member under FDR as the Secretary of Labor. And she became the architect of Social Security, minimum wage, unemployment insurance, regulating child labor. By the way, did you know that we still do not have a national law against child labor? She also refined immigration and naturalization law. So she was a really interesting person. And these are the laws, at least I think of as exemplifying the best of American, of this American moment when people were very concerned about how we treated each other, but also very concerned with supporting manufacturing, but in a way that was sensitive to the American ideal. So this sets off a whole labor movement. This is 1963, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. We all know the I Have a Dream speech. The reason that I point this out here is because very few people remember that this would not have happened, this whole march would not have happened without the Amalgamated Clothing Workers, which is a labor union, right? They made clothes, and the United Auto Workers. 1963 was the moment that civil rights and organized labor were starting to come together. It had been a very difficult 100-some years, right? Because there was a lot of racism in the labor movement. But this marks a moment when they're starting to kind of march in the same direction, which is very important. But it's also the moment, as you can see at the bottom of my slide, how can we reorganize political culture to benefit big business and increase profits? So on the one side, we have civil rights and organized labor starting to really craft a new American ethos. And then on the other side, business is wondering, how can we take all this down? Because it's expensive. It's expensive. And it's cutting into our profits. And it's scary. Okay, enter the late 20th century, where we start to decouple work from profit. What does that mean? It means your labor is no longer valued as a one-to-one deal with business. In other words, you're going to work as long as you work. We're going to pay you as much as we pay you, and that's that. And the people at the top will start to get very wealthy. We're going to see why. This movement entails basically 5 points. One is changing from stakeholders to shareholders. What does that mean? Business used to think of, well, in the ideal world, business used to think of stakeholders. Dexter Shoe Company is a perfect example. Dexter Shoe Company was the only company in Dexter, Maine. Everybody worked for the Dexter Shoe Factory. I actually interviewed Justin Alfond for my book. I have a little chapter about him, and he talks about what it was like to live in a company town as the son and grandson of the owner of the factory. And at first, it was fine. It got much more difficult in the 80s when people started talking about this. But anyway, shareholders. Shareholders are the people who own the company, right? So there's this movement from caring about the people who are working for you and the towns that were created to support industry versus the people who own the company, basically the stockholders. So there's a movement over to the stockholders. There's also movement from an informed citizenry. So we used to have the Fairness Doctrine. Are you familiar with the Fairness Doctrine? So the Fairness Doctrine said that if you were a news agency or if you were a network like ABC, NBC, CBS, remember those? Yes, because we're all old. You had to actually deliver impartial news. At a moment in the day, you were required to just deliver the news. And it was to be impartial. It was simply facts. There was a lot of interest in rolling that back, the Fairness Doctrine. From the moment that it was passed, I think, don't quote me on this, in like 1940, people were fighting against this law. They said it was unconstitutional. And in fact, in 1988, the Fairness Doctrine is rolled back specifically to allow Fox News to do what it does. So Fox News and many others, Rush Limbaugh, many others, wanted to present something that they called fair and balanced. There are many other ways that they talked about this, but the idea was, let's just call news entertainment and divorce it from, doesn't have to be factual necessarily. We're going to present news in a new way. A way that's much more entertaining and profitable. Also, what happens in the 80s? People move from pensions to 401ks. Why is that important? Well, suddenly, you're no longer beholden to your company is no longer beholden to you, right? Your retirement investment is your own damn fault. So if you didn't invest it right, you who are working 8, 10, 12 hours a day, raising kids. If you didn't figure out how to invest your 401k properly, because you were doing other things instead of investing in your 401k, that's your own dang fault. But it also meant that all these people, now citizens of the United States, were very interested in what happened to the stock market in a way that they hadn't been before when they were on pensions. We moved from labor unions to the idea of right to work. So in 1970, can anybody guess what percentage of working Americans in 1970s were union members? Say it louder. 40? I hear 40? 30. 80. Wow, I love that. I wish. So 1 in 3 approximately Americans carried a union card. They were represented by some kind of union. Anybody know what that is now? 15? No, it's 8%. 8% of Americans now. So that's a precipitous drop. And then finally, of course, you all remember, because you all lived through it, Deregulating banking was another focus, so that banks could do all kinds of risky things like mergers and acquisitions, leveraged buyouts, and junk bonds. Why is that important? Because we start to see consolidation like we've never seen it before. I was trying to find a chart for you that really shows the amount of consolidation that started happening in the late 80s and then went like gangbusters in the 90s. The number of companies just shrinks, right? So these companies, so monopolies start to form everywhere. Why does that impact workers and all of us? Well, because you start to lose connection, first of all, with the things that are happening, the things are being made, but also it means you have fewer and fewer choices in what you buy, who you support, all that good stuff. And these are two of the architects behind it. Who's the guy on the right? Huh? Milton Friedman and Ronald Reagan. Okay, so that was the 80s. I also wanted to show you this little graph. Remember what Alexander Hamilton said about tariffs? Tariffs were very high. They had been historically quite high, sometimes as high as 60%. After World War II, suddenly we start to drop tariffs, in part to support Japanese and European economies all over the world. And the idea is they are going to start making things cheaper so that they can supply American industry with cheaper parts so that then Americans can produce cheaper goods and then send them back into the world. And, by the way, the world would then consume our goods. But ultimately, that's not quite what happened. What happened with NAFTA, with the passage of NAFTA, is offshoring. I'm showing this, actually, wait, this is the one I just want to show you. So NAFTA. NAFTA was organized under Bush 1. It was passed under Bill Clinton in 1992. It was very strongly supported by both Democrats and Republicans. The idea, again, was, oh, we're going to be making things cheaper. It will help American businesses become more profitable. Now everybody has 401ks, so we're all tied to the stock market intimately. That's where our money is growing. But at the same time, you see I've circled two things. One is real GDP growth. I want you to see that American flag. It's that first chart. Our real GDP growth starts to drop, and then the chart next to it shows GDP growth per capita. It really plummets. It really plummets. And that's because there is power and money in manufacturing. When you let go of manufacturing, you allow somebody else to manufacture, you actually start to give your money away, in a sense. At least that's how I see it. When we buy Chinese-made, Vietnamese-made, Bangladesh-made goods, we are giving away dollars that we'll never see again. Those dollars are going out of the country. What if we started making things for ourselves again and start to create more of a circular economy and support American manufacturing? But this was good for one group of people, and that is folks at the 1% at the top. We know this, but I think this is a nice little chart to look at. So the blue line at the top is the United States, and then all the other countries, Canada, Italy, Germany, UK, France, and Japan. And you'll see that we far surpass the others in terms of how well the 1% is doing. The 1% is, because we do so much offshoring, the 1% is basically just taking the money out of the economy. They can't spend it fast enough to get it back into the economy. And part of that is because manufacturing, offshore manufacturing is so darn cheap. Sorry about this, it's kind of hard to read, but what I'm showing you here is the cost of a hoodie. So this is a Zara hoodie. Are you familiar with the company Zara? It's a Spanish company. So it's what they call a fast fashion company. So the amount of money that it costs to actually manufacture this sweatshirt, which they actually manufacture mostly in Turkey, is 2 euros. the entire manufacturing process, from growing the cotton to spinning it, to dyeing it, to knitting it, to sewing the garment, everything that goes into this garment and printing it adds up to €2. They sell this hoodie for, I think it says, about 27 euros. So the rest of that money, and this is typical of fast fashion, is either going to profit or to just, marketing, to a little bit to the taxes, the VAT, they have VAT, value-added tax, but mostly to profit. So this is what happens when you take manufacturing away, is companies do pretty well as long as they have folks who are willing to produce for significantly less. Now, this is a really interesting little project. I was excited when I found this. You see how dirty this shirt is? This was this art project that a Swiss artist did. She put ink on a garment worker's hands and then had the garment worker make different articles of clothing to show how much handwork still in 2024 goes into manufacturing apparel. So the result is the shirt. You see how dirty it is? Every single ink stain represents a fingerprint, a moment when the garment worker touched that garment in order to craft it. That's how much work is involved making our clothing, and we don't really actually put a lot of thought into it because we're so divorced from the making, right? I'm actually making I'm wearing a sweater that I made. I'm a knitter, so I do very care very much about how things are made. So we start offshoring, and then we get here, which is empty factories. This was a factory in Massachusetts shot by Chris Payne, a friend of mine. He's a really fabulous photographer, and I'll point out his work everywhere. He does a lot of work for the New York Times, photographing current and abandoned factories. All right, so let's fast forward to 2015. So I'm feeling this, you're feeling this, we're all feeling this, that stuff isn't made in the United States anymore. And so my question, after working on my first book, which was about shipping, was, so if we're not making things anymore, and maybe making things is important for our economy, for our culture, for our sense of selves, what would it look like if somebody tried to do it now? And what would it look like if somebody tried to do something as basic, as cheap, as simple, as making a garment, which we know you can do for €2 in Turkey? Is it possible to make things in the United States anymore? And I was thrilled to find Ben and Whitney Waxman. They're your neighbors. They live in Westbrook, Maine. So the couple on your left is Dan and Dory Waxman. They are the parents of Ben Waxman. Ben Waxman is the gentleman on the right with Whitney Waxman. Ben Waxman was raised here. He went to Portland High, and he worked in the labor movement for 10 years, very high up, all through the first decade of 2000. And that was the most difficult decade for manufacturing and for the labor movement. He was there when the Whirlpool factory shut down. I think it was in Indiana, I want to say. He was there. He saw people losing their jobs, not because these companies and manufacturing facilities weren't profitable. They weren't profitable enough. That was the message. And so he was there when people were training people from away, I won't say what countries, on the very machines that they had made their living using. And then they packed up the machines and they sent them to places like Mexico, China. So Ben had seen all of that, but he had also seen what touched him the most was how strongly community could be built around manufacturing. Again, because manufacturing is one of these amazing industries that allows people who can't even speak English right? To participate in a common goal with folks who maybe have MBAs or PhDs. You will find no greater leveler, no greater range of expertise and knowledge than in manufacturing industry. And this is actually where innovation comes from too. When people make things, they innovate, right? It's very difficult to innovate if you don't know how to make things. In fact, I'm just going to back up. Just briefly, I wanted to tell you one funny story. There was a story in the New York Times magazine a couple years ago about 3 young engineers who had come up with like a really brilliant way to create an espresso machine. It was like a brand new way to do espresso. And they got financing. They got $2 million over Kickstarter. Maybe you saw this story. And they were all ready to go. They were very smart. Obviously, they all had their advanced degrees. You know what tripped them up? They had no idea how to manufacture this thing. They tried working with multiple manufacturers to put parts, to make this part or that part. Nothing fit together. Who should have taken that lesson to heart? Boeing. Do you know why Boeing is having trouble now? Because they gave up manufacturing. So Boeing, at the turn of the century, decided this is a blue chip American company, right? Like everybody wanted to be Boeing. And at the turn of the century, they decided they were going to offshore the manufacturing. And so they had this company and country manufacturing this part, and this company and this country manufacturing this part. And then all those parts were supposed to come together in assembly factories down in the South. And nobody could get these parts to go together. And that's how you end up with an extremely expensive airplane that's kind of jerry-rigged, which is something you don't want to hear when you're flying. That was the 737 MAX, which has had so many problems. The first Boeing product to be almost completely offshore. Okay, back to Ben and Whitney. So Ben comes out of the labor movement. He's never made anything in his life, but he decides that he's going to start a company right here manufacturing, I don't know, apparel. And this is what they start producing. A hoodie, a zippered hoodie. And here is the life cycle right here. You get American-made cotton grown in Texas, Mississippi, all throughout the South. You get the knit and dye houses, massive knit and dye houses that are still around in North Carolina for the most part. The fabric gets rolled onto massive rolls and then shipped over to Fall River where it gets cut. You can see how many pieces are involved in a hoodie. It's a very actually complicated garment to make. And then those cut pieces come up to Westbrook, their factory in Westbrook, which is Dana Mill in the Dana Mill building, beautiful old factory building. Workers put it together, and then it gets shipped all over the country. And here they are. They started the factory, then they got married, They started the factory, then they started having children, then they got married. And this is the factory. And this is the Dana Mill building, and you can see the workers are from all over the world. At this point, mostly from Africa, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Angola, very difficult places. But they found their way here. And since they started in 2015 making sweatshirts and all kinds of things, they've lifted 75 families out of poverty. And that's manufacturing. Like, that's the glory of manufacturing. Okay, 2020, this is how I meet them. 2020, everybody remember 2020? So we were told that we didn't have to wear masks. Why? Because there were no masks. It turns out that most of the masks that physicians and nurses and first responders wore came from China, and China very smartly decided that they were going to hold their stock and stop selling to America. So we were stuck without masks. All over the country, people started pulling out their sewing machines and making masks. Ben and Whitney were sitting on their sofa the night after they closed their factory, after President Trump declared a national emergency. And Whitney turned to Ben and said, "We can make things. We can do this. We can make things." And so they designed their own mask, had materials that they already had, jersey. They had screen printing in-house. They needed a filter Nobody knew how to make a mask, so they had to make this from scratch, and they decided they needed a filter. They worked with a professor from University of Connecticut, a physics professor, to come up with the specifications for the paper. And guess what? Through his union contacts, there's a paper mill in Maine that says, we will get that paper for you. And within 24 hours, they have the paper that they need to go into this mask. And now they start sending them out to first responders in Maine, to Maine state workers, and then all across the country. At the same time, you may remember, this is Chris Payne's photograph again. This is New York City. The New York City hospital systems are freaking out because nurses and doctors are going to have to wear trash bags. And so they solicited from all around the country prototypes for what a homemade gown might look like and how many can you make. And so this is a rack of gowns from manufacturers all over the country. We're just like imagining what this garment could be because nobody made this stuff in America. In fact, even Ford Motor Company ended up making masks. Again, my friend Chris Payne happened to see this. This is a box of masks, face shields, manufactured by Ford because Ford was like, well, we know how to do the assembly line thing, so we could probably put anything together. And they got into the protection racket. No, it wasn't a racket. Protection game as well. Okay, so I want to wrap up because I know that I'm running, that I need to leave time for questions, but I just wanted to tell you very quickly one fun little story about Patagonia, since this is another Maine company. Well, I call it a Maine company. So you may know that the founder of Patagonia was probably a Quebecois, came down to Lewiston, right? His family came down to Lewiston, and then he went out west and founded Patagonia. He then came back east because he was interested in developing a fabric that was like wool, that could be warm when wet, and yet very light. And so he went to Malden Mills. Malden Mills was a third-generation company owned by a Jewish family based in Boston. And Malden Mills, at the time, this was in the 80s, early 80s, was totally cutting edge. It was a lot like a lot of American companies where about 20% of their money, of their profit, was going back into research and development. Why? Not because they were good people, but because that's how you had to survive in business, in manufacturing. You had to keep ahead of the trends. And so the founder of Patagonia says, this is what I'm imagining. Can you help me figure this out? And together, they come up with Polar Fleece. Chris, again, my friend who's the photographer, happened to see some of the last Polar Fleece coming off of the manufacturing floor at Malden Mills. So this is all gone now, but that is a big thing of Polar Fleece that was used for LL Bean, Patagonia, the American military. They all used this textile because it's great textile, invented right here, but it was also American-made. They were bought by private equity. That's another whole story. And unfortunately, now it's made in Taiwan and other places. This is what manufacturing looks like now, and pretty much always has. Very few workers, right? When you're in the textile industry, it's been automated for 200 years almost. And the manufacturing worker is getting older. But fortunately, there are immigrant workers. This young man came from Central America. This is actually Bartlett Yarns in Maine. This is Bloomsburg carpet, still made in the USA, mostly because they are being the carpets are being bought by states, for state houses, that kind of thing. Carpets that need to last, made in America. Here's another local company. This is Darn Tough Socks. It's in Vermont. But you can see that modern manufacturing, very few people. They crank out great socks, though. This is Merrow. They do cut and sew and textile. They are down in Fall River. So I was just quickly going through these to show you these are beautiful printed fabrics. This is in Westerly, Rhode Island. Their product hasn't changed in 75 years. So these are like upholstery and drapery fabrics. And this is actually high-end textiles. This is for the American military. The American military actually has a mandate to buy American if possible. And so these are very kind of high-end camo goods designed and made in the United States. This is one of the last denim companies. It was called Cone Denim Mill in North Carolina. A private equity owner deemed the mill unprofitable and shut it down. And it's no longer made in the United States. That is the same story with Woolrich, which was made in Woolrich, PA. Beautiful. Do you remember the Woolrich coats? Oh my God, just beautiful stuff. And again, bought by private equity, not profitable enough, offshored, which leads to my question, which is, so what does it mean to be Woolrich anymore? And that's that. Thank you.